Greetings, Race community. Brent coming in live from Key West, Florida, trying to flex the remote work muscles here towards the end of the year, but the show must go on, and I am absolutely thrilled to welcome one of our longest-standing friends in the advancement community, Bill Kissick, who is the Chief Advancement Officer at Mercersburg Academy. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Brent. Good to be here.
So Bill and I met within, a couple of months of founding EverTrue. We got connected through the extremely tight-knit independent school community. At the time, Bill was at St. Paul's School, where he spent over 10 years. And it's fun to host Bill in that he has worked in both a higher ed context. He's worked in a boarding school context. We haven't had a lot of boarding school fundraising professionals on the show, and I think it's going to hopefully illuminate a really special part of the advancement community for our listeners who might not be that familiar with it. Before we get into all of that, though, Bill, as you might know from some of our previous episodes, we love just better understanding the higher ed experience and the journey of our guests. And as much as you and I have spent time over the years, I don't know that much about what ultimately inspired you to go from William Penn Charter School to Denison. And so why don't you take me back to junior year of high school at William Penn Charter School? Who was that guy? What was he into? And what led you down that path?
Well, that's interesting, Brent, because junior year of high school, my father took a sabbatical. My dad was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. So he uprooted the family from Philadelphia and moved us to London. So my junior year in high school, I was at the American School in London. And all of the college prep work I did was out of like a Barron's, I think it was Barron's College book. So I was convinced from that American University in DC was a great school. I knew nothing about it except what was in that book. So it was a fabulous year. I didn't want to leave Philadelphia. I had a great thing going at Penn Charter, and then didn't want to come back from London because it was just such a great year being over there.
That's a tough age to just uproot and get planted somewhere else, especially somewhere culturally so unique. I mean, what stands out? First of all, tell me about the American School, and then second, just what were some of your favorite memories from that year? Why didn't you want to come home?
Well, as an athlete, Brent, I think you'll get this. I was the goalie on the soccer team at Penn Charter, and moving to London, I was up against two senior goaltenders, and I didn't stand a chance. So I had to learn to play the field. And then coming back, one of my best friends had quit football to move over to soccer to be the goalie the year I was away. I didn't want to take his position, so I ended up playing, defensive back. But London was it was 74, 75. It was letter bombs going off. So there were nights coming home where your route home was disrupted because a bomb had gone off in a mailbox and they shut down the streets. The American School in London at that point in time was very much an oil and gas driven school. And we had 2 or 3 bomb scares when I was there. We'd have to evacuate the whole school and, go out onto the streets and stuff. And a lot of people I still remember one of my
just to be clear, Bill, nothing that you've said so far explains to me why you didn't want to leave. I'm waiting for that part of the story, but that sounds kind of crazy, to be honest, to be dropped into that, but I'm sure some lessons along with it.
It was a crazy time, but it was also, the whole London experience. I was very into musical theater, and being able to go see shows pretty cheaply on a regular basis was nice. Made some amazing friends who had moved sort of all over the world. A lot of our people were, they worked for Gone Everywhere, GE, or I've Been Moved, IBM. And, they'd lived in Paris for a couple of years. They'd lived in London for a couple of years. They were sort of transient, if you will, executive children. And it was a co-ed school, which Penn Charter at that time was all boys. And that was pretty advantageous. So
And then ultimately you spent 1 year and did go back and graduate from Penn Charter.
Yeah, came back, graduated from Penn Charter. From there, went to Denison in Granville, Ohio. That's actually where I started my development career. I was a student fundraising volunteer my sophomore year. And quite honestly, Brent, I was not intent on doing it. A fraternity brother of mine was running the program, and he, of course, signed us all up. And the night that I was scheduled to volunteer, there was a snowstorm. So he came by my room and offered me a ride. And I was like, I guess I'm not getting out of this. But I ended up enjoying it, ended up running that program my junior and senior year. And then after
and so what did that entail, running the program your junior and senior year, Bill?
Oh, we had 15 phones a night, Monday to Thursday, calling from 8 to 10. And it was my job to recruit the other students to be the volunteers, to be the cheerleader, to be giving them, their next batch of assignments, training them, and doing, we did all kinds of crazy stuff to, rally the troops and things. You just imagine the kind of stuff you do when you're in college age. And it was a lot of fun.
But you couldn't even pay them. I mean, that's like that sounds like a pretty professional volunteer operation.
So we had beer and pizza, and we let each kid make one phone call on their own during the night. So, and it was during Denison at that time had a J term. So, it was about a third of the kids on campus. And quite honestly, a lot of the kids who came in used their free phone call to call a boyfriend or a girlfriend who weren't on campus during that month. So, but that's
talk about perks and benefits.
Whatever you can do, people in the door.
So you had a very early, we talk about the student calling programs as basically being the gateway drug to advancement leadership. It's amazing how many of our guests started and got exposed, because, candidly, without that, it's very possible to go through your all 4 years of college and not even know that philanthropy is a thing, much less understand how it works. At what point did you think about it as a viable career path? And I'm actually not sure what you did immediately out of college.
So that's interesting. I actually thought that I wanted to be in advertising. And I can still remember when I graduated, the drill was your resume had a job description right below your name, or a dream job. And mine was something to the effect of, I want to advance, sell, or promote a product, service, or cause in which I believe. And I'm convinced that the in which I believe is what kept me out of advertising, because their job is to sell whatever it is they're selling. And personally, both my parents were first in their family to go to college. That gave them a better life, gave me and my siblings a better life, and in turn has given my children a better life. So for me, serving education is a great way to recognize the impact it's had on my life, and then to sort of pay it forward, if you will, to the faculty and students and staff who benefit from what we've put together going forward.
I love it. Yeah, it
sounds backwards.
Sounds like you did, and you still are working in advertising in a certain regard. It just happens to be something you really believe in. And so if you didn't go down the advertising path, what did you do right out of school?
So actually, my first year out of school, I bounced around on a couple of jobs because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. The year after that, the person I reported to at Denison left the advancement field to go into banking. And he reached out to me and said, I know you don't have your dream job yet. Why don't you come here and do this? And so my attitude was I'd go there for a couple of years, leave, get my MBA, and then get my job in advertising. And, I did get an MBA, but, 40 years later, I'm still in this industry and happy that I didn't go into advertising. So
tell me about the MBA experience. You got your MBA at Wharton. Pretty rare within the advancement leadership realm to pursue MBAs, and not too many at Wharton specifically. What stands out from your time there, and then ultimately, how did that shape your post MBA path?
So, two funny stories about that. One, I like to say that I went to the best school I could afford, because my father was professor at Penn. And when he started at Penn, it was a benefit that your children went to any Penn degree program for free. So I didn't have to pay any tuition. The third position I had, so my career was, I did 2 years at Denison, then 2.5 years at Penn Charter, and then I went to St. Lawrence in upstate New York as a gift officer. So that was my first frontline gift officer job. And a lot of the prospects I was working with were alums, young alums on Wall Street. And I just didn't understand what they were doing. And it made me feel inadequate not to be able to speak their language, to know sort of what they were doing. So, that was part of my reason for going to business school, was to better understand, money. But also, my major was in strategic planning. So I think that helps. I loved the statistics that I got, and just a better sense of the world that many of the people that I work with play in.
That's a pretty big investment to build empathy with your prospects, but it sounds like it was really worthwhile. But even being in the MBA program and getting exposed to all those different verticals and possible career paths, you maintained your commitment to the mission-driven sector that you have made your professional home.
Yeah, I would joke that I think I was the only student that did not set foot in the career planning office.
So what did you do instead, and where did it lead right out of school?
So it was all networking. I can't remember exactly how many offers I had, but coming out of school, the job that I took was as a major gift officer at Dartmouth College, focusing on their western part of the country. So basically draw a line north and south at Denver. I had everything west of that. Another offer I had was director of major gifts at Bucknell, director of major gifts at Occidental. And then I think I had the director of development at the Webb schools in Southern California. But chose to go the Ivy route, which I really enjoyed. I learned a lot by being in that crowd. To this day, some of my best professional friends are peers of mine that were the major gift person for New York City, Will Davison, the major gift person for New England, Colleen Bartlett. Those were great times, and saw some very significant successes, and that really sort of put my career on a different trajectory.
I'm not going to date you, Bill, too much, but you started your career without an email address, without a cell phone, without, probably barely even a computer. Did you have a computer at the first role at Dartmouth?
No, I did at Dartmouth. But funny story about that. I remember being in business school, working on a paper in the computer lab, and one of the kids next to me said, "Can you imagine writing papers before PCs?" And I looked at him and I said, "When I was in college, my rich roommate had a Selectric typewriter that had the pop-out eraser thing, and that was high tech." And the guy looked at me like, "How old are you?"
Magical. And so for those, we have a lot of newer professionals or younger professionals in the sector who listen to the show. How did you do the work without any of the things we have at our disposal today, Bill? What did you actually do west of Denver, and how did you do it early on?
So you'll get a kick out of this, Brent. When I used to go to California, I would take 3 or 4 of the, now I'm drawing a blank on the name of the map, but they were these big spiral bound maps that you would use to find your way around. And I would FedEx them home when I left LA as I was going up to San Francisco. In San Francisco, they're Thomas Guide, that's what they're called. In San Francisco, you needed 2, one for the valley and one for the city. And no phone, just do it. Everything was done in a very different way. And, and getting appointments was you'd send somebody a letter, wait a week, call them, end up talking to an assistant, try to get through that person to get an appointment and go from there. So I look at what we have today, and it's just, the ability to do everything you can do on your little computer in your pocket just makes this world so much easier.
In spite of having so little technology at your disposal, when you think about some of the early visits in your career that really stand out, or if there were moments when you really felt like you were getting the hang of the work, I mean, are there any early conversations or early wins, if you will, early closed gifts that you still think about as being maybe pretty pivotal in your career path?
There were two that both happened at Dartmouth. And one, I remember my first visit, it was a venture capitalist at Sequoia Capital. And he had made a $35,000 gift for his 35th reunion. And this was 1991. Dartmouth had been, their mascot had been the Indians. They had moved beyond that to the big green. But he was wearing his Indian tie, which was a relic. And he said something to the effect of, "You're not in my will and you're not getting a major gift. What do you want to talk about?" And I had a very thorough strategic plan that John Strobane, who was the provost at Dartmouth, had led. It was probably a 70 or 80 page book. And I had that with me. And I just started walking him through that. And I think as a venture capitalist, he was intrigued by the business way of us looking at the education we were providing at Dartmouth, how we might change it and why. And that led to, I was lucky at that point in my career. I had the provost would travel with me, the dean of faculty would travel with me, head of athletics would. People loved going to California. And every time I went there, I was able to take somebody else to see this individual. And he actually ended up endowing the Native American program, which, imagine going from wearing your Indian tie to, and it was all because of an experience, well, for a lot of reasons, but one was that his son had a transformational experience on a reservation during a summer. And so he wanted to that was his way of paying it forward, if you will. So the second sort of significant gift that I was a part of at Dartmouth was an individual who he'd only made one gift to the college, and it was his father, who was also an alum, had solicited him to help with a project that was of interest to the father. And this was an individual who I was just convinced cared deeply about the college and wanted to do something significant, but hadn't found that opportunity, if you will. And we actually had a renovation of a building that allowed it to be renamed. And it was something that I went to him with, and in 3 months, he agreed to do the entire commitment. And, that was also a sort of career arc changing sort of gift. So.
And when you think about the first example, and maybe there are others in your career where basically they take the visit, but they lead with, "There's nothing happening here. Like, this is not, like, you're not in my will, and I'm not making a major gift." I would imagine those conversations happen every single day in the advancement sector. And I would also imagine that most of the time, people politely leave and disqualify that prospect and move on to the next person in the portfolio or in the qualification pool. How do you think about the persistence and kind of perseverance required, while at the same time balancing that with the expression, don't throw good money after bad, right? Don't go chasing and wasting your limited time and plane ticket resources on somebody that isn't going to ever come around. I mean, that's got to be a real game of psychology where you have to make those decisions every day. And how do you guide your team when they hear, "You're not my will, you're not you're not getting a major gift"? How do you know when to keep pressing?
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of the Gladwell 10,000 hour rule. And I think a lot of this you just acquire over time. And what I try to work with anybody on one of my teams, I say, no is not always no. It may be not now, it may be not that project, it may be not that amount. And the skill you get is when you can realize that no doesn't mean no. It means one of those other challenges, and then you think about the decision tree, you can think about, okay, that's not the right project, but they're interested. So what other projects might I put forward? Or it's not the right time. They're going through some family challenge. I just need to wait that out. Or it's not that right amount. I still remember one case when I was at Deerfield, we'd asked a current parent for a significant senior class gift. And the family came in and they were talking to me. And it was clear to me that we had just asked for too much. And so I'm thinking, how do I sort of let them down gently? They were asking about how I came up with a number. And I said, well, we do a little bit of research, and then we just double it. And the relief on their face was significant because I gave them a way to do something significant for them, but less than what we'd asked for, because we had in fact asked for too much in my mind. So, and that's just part of the human nature of what we do, is sometimes you ask for too little or for too much. And how do you, with grace and dignity, allow that person to do something that feels right for them?
Yeah. It's one of the most fascinating areas of this field that I think is unlike just about any other sector, which is, when you think about pricing strategy, right? Like there's all these MBA classes on pricing strategy and, how much should a Tesla cost, right? Or how much should a cup of coffee cost? And what is the, marginal increase in price due to demand? And you can run all kinds of tests. You can't do that when you're talking about $100,000, a $500,000, $1 million gift.
Yeah.
And ultimately, philanthropy is the ultimate discretionary purchase, if you will. And so I am curious if you have other experiences where, our friend Jim Zimmerman has probably shared, and I need to get him on the podcast, but he has shared one of the all-time greatest over asking stories where he really asked for too much money, where it was just, totally out of the realm. Have you ever had that happen? And then on the other hand, have you ever under asked where somebody was almost disappointed in how little you asked for?
Yes, yes to all of those. And one lesson I learned early on is that just because one approach works for one person doesn't mean it's going to work for another. And so again, I had this young entrepreneur in LA who at the time I thought I was asking for him to be the youngest person to put his name on a building at an Ivy League institution. And it worked. He did it, and he's been generous to Dartmouth many, many times since then. I got a little out over my skis and tried that same approach with an oil and gas guy in his, class of 50s. And I remember following up with the assistant to get the follow-up call. And I think her exact words were something like, he won't let you tell him what to do with his money. Goodbye. And I was like, okay, lesson learned. I burned that bridge. And, luckily since then, somebody else came on, took that job and was able to rebuild that bridge. But, there are times when you do make those mistakes and, you're as gracious as you can and, try to mend it. But that's a risk sometimes you take that, I won't do that again. I learned that lesson. But
yeah, I mean, look, it's a balance, because if you don't challenge people, it mitigates the amount of impact, and hopefully you can keep that in mind, as folks listening make those stretch asks, you're doing it with really good intentions, but it doesn't mean mistakes don't happen. How about on the other hand, have you ever under asked?
Oh, I'm sure I've under asked more times than I know about. And to your point that you were.
How do you know? Is it just when the yes is too quick? Sorry to interrupt, but I want to know how do you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I still remember early on in my career, visited with a fellow, and he wrote a check on the spot, and it was if he can do that, I didn't ask for the right amount. And I have something written up on my whiteboard that part of our business is to enable people to move from success to significance. So, you can have a great career and be very successful, but, through philanthropy, you can make yourself significant. And that's what I like to think about, is how do we give people the opportunity to make a difference in the world.
I love it, Bill. Tell me about the decision to move from really successful, almost, let's call it elite higher education advancement experiences. What was your catalyst to explore the boarding school world? And just tell me about that journey.
Well, it's a personal one for me, because I learned early on in my career that, as I like to say, I'm allergic to bureaucracy. And, I don't know how big the Dartmouth, they're wonderful up there, but it's hundreds of people. I did a capital campaign presentation last week for Case, and I was on with somebody from the University of Texas. He had more gift officers working for him than we have entire staff at Mercersburg. And I just, when I want to know how my gift officers are doing, I look out the door. There are two of them. One's not here today. One is. I know he's traveling. I don't know how Juan keeps track of, I think he said 140, gift officers. So for me, it's a scope thing and it's an impact thing. I can see, I know the people here in a way that, that's hard, that for me at least, it was hard to know working in a bigger shop where you may not even be on campus.
One of the unique nuances of the boarding school world, relative to the broader independent school, day school community, for example, is truly how international those programs are. And I know that you've shared in the past just some incredible stories about, certainly in a pre-pandemic context, the world of international boarding school fundraising and the seasonal cycles, and running into some of your colleagues from the Northeast, at the same hotels in the same cities at the same times. Very few members of the advancement community, much less our audience, will ever get a window into that world. So maybe just walk us through, and maybe even some of your first Asian fundraising experiences in the boarding school community, and just what was that like?
Well, it is, I would joke with, I usually travel with my head of school or my head of admissions, and, our families would roll out the red carpet for us. And my line to my colleagues was, I'm just a kid from Philly, I'm only here because of the school I represent. And it's a different experience when these families are sending their children halfway around the world, and the amount of trust they're putting in you to take care of their children. If you're a family from New York City and, something goes wrong and your kid's at St. Paul's, you can be there in 2 or 3 hours. If you're in Hong Kong, you can't get to, the States for 2 or 3 days, maybe. And so there's a whole level of trust that I just found incredibly generous in terms of how those families would think about us taking care of their kids, which is, in many cases, their most precious gift to the world. That said, the development world over there is incredible. I would joke, I would see, I was at admissions events where you'd see people get up midway through, and it's
Hey, Bill. Hey, Bill, give me 1 second. I'm just going to dial back in because this is really good and I'm having a hard time hearing you. I'm going to come in via my phone really quick. I'll dial right back. Yeah, just I'll just kind of tee up again. Most of our listeners will never get a window into the boarding school fundraising experience, and especially how international it can be. And you've shared in the past just some of the amazing experiences in Asia, and I just love to kind of get your perspective, and maybe even on some of those early journeys over there, just kind of what stood out as you were representing your schools in that market.
Well, the thing that stands out the most is the sort of love and admiration that the families have for the schools, especially when you think about sending your child halfway around the world, having a sense that they're going to be safe and secure and well taken care of. is a critical component to what we do. And their sort of thanks for us just doing our jobs, if you will, was just always very humbling.
And you've always said, getting a meeting was not nearly the challenge, and the prospecting into a parent that is making such a big investment into the community relative to, an alum that's been disconnected. It's pretty different.
It's very different. And, I rarely would have to leave the hotel. They would say, no, we'll come to you. It's not, come to my office the way it would be, with people here in America who are in an office today, which is a different thing. But, they would come to you and everybody would take your call. They'd be honored to meet, you, and, you're just there as a representative of your school. It's not as though, you're some, rock star, but you really were treated like royalty, if you will. And it was a lot of fun. The travel is exciting. I happen to like the food. There are some people who say you need an iron stomach over there. For me, that was just part of the joy of it all. And just their real sense of, how these institutions, especially boarding schools at that age, are really setting their children, or if they're an alum, setting them up for life. And, that really is, education is a huge sort of success factor in Asia, and they're just complete joy in having their child at your school. And, they would talk about it as their school.
One of the things you shared in the past, Bill, is just how tight-knit the independent school fundraising community is, the advancement community. I know many of the, folks that were leading some of your competitor schools became close friends, and that you all were really and still are collaborative and willing to share with one another. Just tell me a little bit about what it was like to operate in that kind of segment of the broader case advancement community.
Well, that's, going back to your, pricing, we're not selling widgets, and we do compete with each other in terms of wanting to enroll the best and brightest kids. But at the end of the day, we're a collaborative group that shares information. And I've been blessed in my career to have some wonderful colleagues, mentors, friends, who I can reach out to whenever I'm up against a challenge that I'm not sure how to handle. I still remember a time in the last campaign I ran where we'd hit a bit of a drag. We weren't really making progress. And I called one of my colleagues and said, we've hit a wall. I'm not sure what to do. And she said, it happens to everybody. Sort of welcome to the club. There's a time in a campaign where you go sideways for what could be, 2 or 3 quarters. And that's just part of running a campaign. So don't let it tear you down. Just keep on. I remember another time where we had a building project with a deadline we were trying to solve. And I reached out to another colleague and said, have you ever done this? And he said, we had that exact same issue 4 years ago with our building, and here's what we did. And that, to your technology thing, I just took it from, he said we used a fax machine. So instead of that, we used an email, but we did a very similar approach, and it ended up being successful. And that's one of my bits of advice to anybody sort of coming up in this business is build your peer network. There are many cases where you can get better advice from a peer than you will a consultant, and it doesn't cost you anything. And, I just, I could rattle off, I don't know how many names of people in this business that, I really trust their advice. There are people that I talk to on a regular basis, and, they're colleagues, and I would say friends. And, that's my go-to group.
Rattle off a few names, because that's how we get our next guest for the Raise podcast. Who comes to mind?
Well, some of the best in the business, Colleen Bartlett, who's now at the Crossroads Academy in LA. She and I started at Dartmouth together back in 1990. Will Davison, who's retired but doing consulting, was also at Dartmouth then. I could, rattle, well, let me see, who else? Mary Kate Barnes at Lawrenceville, Dan Corsi at Choate.
Yeah, I think it's important for the audience who again is not as probably common or familiar with the independent and boarding school community to understand just truly how tight knit it is. And it's I think maybe with that, Bill, like if there are folks listening who hadn't thought about the independent school world or the boarding school world, what is the pitch for them to maybe consider that as they think about future steps in their career? Are you hiring at Mercersburg? I mean, why might somebody consider moving out of the elite or large public higher education fundraising world to a smaller, more tight-knit community?
Well, I will start by saying, and I believe this is an accurate quote, that Bruce McClintock, who is now retired from March and Lundy, used to say that the best advancement people that he knows are in boarding schools. And so, I do think it's a tight-knit group. It's a wonderfully supportive group. It's different than a big university. It's a boarding school, especially for the faculty. They live here, they teach here, they raise their families here. It's I used to joke with my head of school at St. Paul's that he was the mayor. He had to be everything to everybody. So it's very different than what I would call a 9-to-5 job at a bigger institution where you go home to your community. Here, your community tends to be your school. And you get to see you're closer to your impact, which to me is what this is all about. And it's being able to get to know more of the faculty on a first name basis, getting to know kids on a first name basis, and being a part of something that really is special and changes the trajectory of kids' lives. I went to a K-12 day school. It was a great experience, but it's not as, all encompassing, if you will, as a boarding school. The kids who come here, the faculty are their family. I still remember my older daughter who did go to St. Paul's said that the woman who ran her dorm was like her second mother. And I don't know of many, at least for me personally, I didn't have that experience at a day school where I felt that one of my faculty members was like my second mom or my second dad. So, and we are hiring.
That's really well said, Bill. And I'll let you speak to hiring before we wrap here in a few minutes. But I also just have to ask, given the global nature of the community, the trips to Asia that you've described in the past, juxtaposed with the pandemic, I imagine this has been a particularly, unique and radical shift in how you've done your job as a leader in your community. And I know that you're hungry to be able to get back out on the road, and maybe you've been able to in a limited extent at this point. But, when's your next trip to Asia? I mean, is the old way of that kind of work ever coming back, or do you feel like it's been changed forever?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, Brent. I hope it comes back. I had budgeted for 2 trips to Asia this year. I did not go in the fall, and I don't think I'm going to go in the spring. I may be able to pull off a summer trip. We are starting to do events again and some regional travel. This is a case where I personally think that, my lack of ability to live in a more digital world makes it harder for me to do my work. I mean, I'm a guy who, I'm used to spending 90 days a year on the road. And, I've been, here for the past year and a half. Again, we started to do some small travel. I wonder if we're going to shift from a world of large scale, what I call all-in events, to more targeted, smaller events, just given the COVID world we live in. I mean, what was it? Cornell just shut down yesterday. We had a breakthrough case here last week. We were supposed to have our kids go home tomorrow. We let them go home over the weekend. We're down to probably less than a quarter of our students on campus. I just think that COVID's not going away, and we're going to have to figure out how to do our work in a different world.
Yeah, and I wonder, look, I think that ultimately, I'm sure throughout your career, you've had some incredibly meaningful trips, some of which you've shared today. But I bet there have been a lot of busts as well. Trips that just went nowhere fast. that, that took a lot of time. And
Yep.
I wonder if we don't land in an area where instead of, you being on the road 90 days a year, maybe the 80-20 rule applies and you're on the road 20 days a year, but it ends up being highly qualified, extremely meaningful, high impact travel.
Yeah.
And maybe some of the other marginal travel and visits do shift to digital. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's better for the school, better for the budget, fine with the donors who are comfortable operating that way, while at the same time reserving the in-person experiences for the more, transformational or conversations that would require it to get to the yes.
Well, that's, we are a relational, at least in my view, we're a relational business. And so how do we create real relationships in a world where that's not done in a traditional face-to-face way? And I do, this is my third year here at Mercersburg. I do think I would be better at doing my job at St. Paul's, where I was for 13 years, because I already had those relationships. And we're here, it's how do you create them in a virtual way? And how do you do them with some audiences that just aren't comfortable in a virtual fashion? I have some of our more generous, alums who happen to be my age or older who just aren't willing to engage in a virtual way. And so how do we do that successfully? And that's a lot of what I spend time talking with my peers about is, we've all lamented not being able to go to Asia to build those relationships with our new families. So how do we do that in a virtual fashion, which we've all tried different things with some success. But that to me is going to be the challenge we all face going forward is COVID's not going away. We've got to figure out a different way to create these relationships. And I think it is going to be different for people of different age groups and their comfort level with that way of business.
I hear you. At the same time, I would argue that over the last 18 months, a lot of those people who might not have been comfortable building relationships virtually had to FaceTime their kids, and they learned how to do Zooms with their college classes or with their friend groups or with business deals. And so we have been given somewhat of a gift in the digital acceleration that we've experienced. And the question then is, how do we harness it for this philanthropic world? I think back to the example you gave at Dartmouth, where the AD used to go with you or the provost used to go with you. I know it was not easy for you to get the AD's time or the provost's time or a faculty member's time, and scheduling around their ability to get to the West Coast was not easy. So how do we start thinking about, or continue to think about, in a world where our entire community is a Zoom link away, how do we start accelerating the number of touch points a head of school or a coach or a faculty member or a first generation student can have with alumni, parents, and friends, even if it means they're not able to get on the plane with you and sit down with the person? And so do we make up some lack of just in-person relationship building? Can we make up for that with a higher volume of still highly authentic and very personalized conversations, even if it's not as fun via Zoom? If you can have the head of school talk to 10 people a week via Zoom versus going on a trip a couple times a year, is there a way to net out ahead?
I believe there is. I think that a lot of, at least in my mind, a lot of schools are struggling with that transition. And, you've been a great sort of role model in thinking about, what do you call the digital engagement officers, or what are the people who are sort of...
Yeah, the donor experience officer program is one that's growing really quickly. And ultimately, that's just, forever, advancement has been an outside sales business. You've been doing outside field sales for a mission. And if you weren't doing outside sales, you were doing direct marketing via the annual fund. And in between, in the middle of the pyramid, we think there's a huge opportunity for mission-driven inside sales. And we believed that before the pandemic.
but the pandemic has obviously accelerated. It's forced people to embrace that model. And then the question is, how do you do it? What's the right technology? What's the right data? But I believe very strongly that reaching people one-to-one, truly one-to-one, in a world where we've all been added to a million, marketing campaign lists and automated email lists, is going to be more important than ever. And it's not as good as getting out and seeing someone in person, but it's a heck of a lot more efficient. And we know that for a growing portion of the donor community, they don't need you to get on a plane and go see them. And frankly, they don't want you spending $2,000 to get on a plane and get a hotel and go see somebody. Yeah. And for the people who do need that, hopefully we can get back to it, but also, reorient the mix of our travel.
Yeah. No, I think the best sort of comparable business, and it's a business, so you need them, but is banking. And I look at it from the sort of the transactional part of banking, which is I have an ATM card. I never want to go into a bank and see a person, but that enables me to do what I need to do. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is I'm a high net worth individual. I want a personal banker that I know who's helping me make investment decisions, taxes, whatever. And, and that's the spectrum that we work in advancement. We go from annual giving, which is at the lower end, a sort of a transactional commitment, to, principal gifts, which is, I know you, you know me, and so I'd love to know more about how sort of the high net worth bankers are doing their business in a digital world. But the difference is you don't need philanthropy, you need a bank. And so it's not not a direct comparison, but in some ways, I think that they're very similar to what we're trying to do at the higher end of the donor experience.
Well, here's what I'm going to do, Bill. I'm going to try to track down a high net worth money manager and get them on the show, because I think that's a great example. They've lived through a shift as well. But I think it's the middle part of that spectrum that you just described: ATM, transactional on the low end, high net worth private banker on the other end. What about the middle? Who are the loan officers, right? Who are the people where, I don't need to go sit down with my loan officer, but I do need to be able to talk to my loan officer. I need to be able to email with my loan officer. I need a one-on-one relationship, but I don't need them to fly out and see me necessarily. And I think that equivalent role where there's a true one-to-one relationship manager that is still higher touch than a transactional ATM and lower touch than a high net worth money manager, that has been a missing link in the advancement org chart that we think has to be filled.
I totally agree. And I do think that's a case where the larger, more bureaucratic institutions have the human capital to make that work in a way that a lot of independent schools don't. I mean, again, I'm a total staff of 18, and I don't have a FTE that could be full-time dedicated to that middle market. And that's a challenge, for, at least in my view, that schools I've worked at have to wrestle with.
Yeah, I mean, it would require a leap of faith right now that might feel uncomfortable, but that's a fun conversation that's evolving. And hopefully, as we get more data, as more of these programs mature, we'll be able to help provide that data so that you actually might be able to run some numbers and realize, hey, actually, if we took one of the 18 and we allocated them to the 750 people in the middle of the giving pyramid that need more than an ATM machine and less than me visiting them, maybe there is an ROI there. And hopefully we'll be able to share that kind of information very soon. Bill, we've got to wrap. Thank you so much. I think this is going to be a very good window into the boarding school world and the independent school world for many of our listeners. Make the pitch for Mercersburg. I mean, what is Mercersburg? Are you hiring? And why should our audience have Mercersburg on their radar?
Well, we are hiring, and I think we're a school right now that we have the resources to take some calculated risks. We are thinking about moving from, well, we've already left the sort of AP world. We're not teaching to the test anymore. And we're moving more in the meaning and mastery way of teaching. We are part of the Mastery Transcript Consortium. I do think that schools are moving away from, again, I go back to when I was in school, no one had a computer. Now everybody's got one in their pocket. Information and data is easy to get. It's no longer teaching people facts and figures, it's teaching them how to think and what to think about. And I'll give you one example. We had a kid 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, who was part of an independent project, decided that he wanted to turn on a light bulb with his brain. And no teacher would have given him that assignment. That's just way too audacious to give to a kid. He came up with the idea and he did it. He actually turned down Google to go to college instead. I think if you think about giving kids a project that's meaningful to them, that they can master, and it's sort of, athletics is a great example. And I think if we just can teach that way, we will move away from, education 10, 15, 20 years ago to education that's leading to 10, 15, 20 years into the future. So that's what we're all about here. We're a small school. I think we just got a lot going for us right now. Phenomenal leadership.
I love it, Bill. So well said. So if you're listening and you're not excited about turning light bulbs on with your brain, it's not the place for you, but that's pretty amazing. I love that example, Bill. And thank you for sharing your time today, sharing your perspective with our audience, and for being a good friend to me over the last 10 years, and excited to continue to learn from you and hopefully provide you some perspective as well. So if people want to stay in touch, Bill, what's the best way to get in touch with you? I know you're on LinkedIn. What else?
LinkedIn, or just, email kissickb@mercersburg.com, So, and again, thank you, Brent. I love what your business has done. You've pushed the envelope in a bunch of different ways that has made a lot of us older guys think about how we do our work. So keep it up.
Thank you, Bill. I really, really appreciate that. All right, race community. Hope you enjoyed the show with Bill. And with that, Brent signing off from Key West with Bill Kissick, who's the Chief Advancement Officer at Mercersburg Academy. Thanks again, Bill. Take care.
Thanks, Brent.